This video is for my nephew, and it concerns evolution, so you know who you are. I just want to continue the conversation that we were having that never was completed. Maybe you thought it was finished, but it wasn't. You know, we were talking about evolution, and you were making fun of evolution. I don't know why you would make fun of something that's obvious, and evolution is obvious, but you were. Obviously, you've been listening to people who don't know what they're talking about, but like most of us, members of our hard-headed family, you want to know everything, even when you don't. And you want everybody to know that you know everything, and you won't listen to the things that you should learn. But we should learn, and that's another thing about our family, is we have the ability to learn. And we do eventually learn. Hopefully you will learn sooner than later. Now, in our conversation on evolution, I asked you to look up the definition. You looked up the definition and you gave me two different definitions. Neither was the definition that I was looking for. Both of them were correct, but not what I was looking for, and you knew they weren't what I was looking for. That's the reason you gave them to me. In the end, I gave you the other definition, the one that I wanted, and that's kind of where the conversation stopped. But I'm going back to the conversation and tell you, when you said that evolution is the change from one animal to another over a period of time, that is called speciation, and animals do change, and they do come from other animals, and it's populations that change, not individuals. Individuals are just mutants, and mutations occur regularly too. In fact, we all carry different mutations, and those mutations can be passed on if they give beneficial survivability, whatever that survivability is. Evolution is not unidirectional. It can go one way, or it can go back the other way, or it can go a completely different direction. It's just change. You also gave me the definition of evolution being how animals had begun, how organisms had begun as one single cell, and from that cell, all other organisms were derived, giving rise to what we have today. Quite true, but that's a very long range. That's not what we look at when we look at evolution on the short scale that we observe. Evolution, from a scientific definition, is nothing more and nothing less than changing of alleles within a population over time. Alleles are genes that code for specific proteins. Those specific proteins are what your body creates to make you what you are. Those specific proteins are the things that other animals and other organisms create to make them what they are. They are the product of the DNA and the RNA that give the code for what you or whatever the organism is. Changes can be made in this code by many types of mutations. They can be insertions, where a new base is put in, changing the structure of the protein that is produced. They can be made by deletions, where one of those bases has been removed. They can be where you have a translocation of a segment of DNA from one place to another. It can be where you have a whole chromosomal mutation, where you have excessive amounts of proteins produced as you see when you see children that we call mongoloids that have Down syndrome, trisomy 21. They obviously are different than the rest of us, and they are different because of the amount of a specific protein that they produce, and they are the addition of genetic material in that they have a whole chromosomal mutation. They have extra amounts of proteins and different interactions of their proteins to create something different. Those characteristics could be selected for in the right environment. They're not in our environment, but it's possible that those characteristics could be selected for, and if they became more and more in a population, we would call that evolution. A population is the whole group, a group, any specific group, and we see changes of genes, the amount of genes, the percentage of genes, alleles, in a population over time all over the world. You can see it in human populations, and you can see that it is change over time that has created the variety of characteristics that we have today within populations all over the world. That's evolution. Humans continue to evolve. If they evolve a greater ability to digest lactose, and we have, that has evolved. You are much more lactose tolerant as a society. Your society is much more lactose tolerant than societies of the past, because we have begun to depend upon milk as one of the staples of our diet, and that gives us the greater survivability if we are lactose tolerant. Fact of nature. You're the product of evolution. You can like it or not like it. Now, that brings us back to the conversation and what I asked you about cattle. You work on a ranch, you work with cattle. I asked you what types of cattle you work with. You told me. Herefords and Angus. Well, how do you think they got that way? The Hereford has a white face and red hair. The Angus has black hair overall. They were specifically bred for those traits and that body that they have, that block-shaped body, to produce massive amounts of meat. They were bred specifically, changing the genes within the population to get those characteristics. That's called human intervention, but it's still evolution. That's what Darwin talked about when he talked about the changing in farm animals. It happens. Now you can say, well, that's artificial because humans did it. It doesn't matter if it's artificial or not. Everything has some cause for the changing of the genes in a population. Everything. Throughout nature you have this. There's something in the environment that causes the change. In this particular case, it was human desires. One was the desire for the black, the other desire for the red with the white face. These were traits that were selected for, and you know them well. But those aren't the only cattle. Those cattle were both of those populations were bred from the mighty ark of Europe. The huge cow, huge bulls. You still see some of their fighting attitudes in the fighting cattle of Spain. Neither Hereford nor Angus. They've been selected for because of their fire and because they will fight humans quickly and readily. Unlike the ones that you are around, which have been bred not to be fighters. You also see it when you look at the longhorn cattle that were brought across by Columbus and the Spanish and left in the southern parts of the United States to breed in huge herds to become the longhorns, and the longhorns are mighty cattle, much like the ark. And the mighty ark may have still been alive at that time in certain parts of Europe. It's extinct now. But the genes of the mighty ark are there in the Hereford, they're there in the Angus, they're there in the Spanish fighting cattle, they're there in the Longhorn. And they're there in other breeds of cattle also, the Charolais, and the different ones that have different characteristics. Each one has been bred for a different environment. I don't know how many of the genes are still present in the Brahma cattle, much further away in Asia, or the cattle from Africa that they use down there for specific environments. But I do know this, you can breed those that you're talking about with the cattle of Asia. You can breed them with the cattle of the Himalayas. Very different, long-haired. And you can get a hybrid. Now, the reason you don't have this happening was something called breeding isolation. And as things are isolated over long periods of time, they don't reproduce together anymore. You can see that as an example in the donkey and the horse. Now, in the donkey and the horse, regardless of how long they've been isolated from one another, they will no longer produce offspring that can produce offspring. They will reproduce together to create a mule. Different horses are different enough that they may or may not be able to, but the zebra is just another one of the horses, as are many of the others, that the Shetlands and the different ones that have evolved to the environment in which they found themselves. The same as the Himalayan cows are so different from the cattle that you herd. By the way, the Holstein and the Jersey and the Guernsey and the brown Swiss and the milkers also came from the mighty ark. But they definitely are in a different environment now because they have been selected for different purposes. In the southern part of New Mexico, the herds down there run cattle called the Santa Gertrudis, which have large amounts of the genes from Brahma cattle from India. Now, these cattle are really good at resisting water loss. They're really good in the dry environment, as are the cattle that are raised in parts of Africa along the deserts. They survive well without much water in really rough environment. The ones you heard aren't quite as hardy in those environments. Obviously, things are selected for it. You may not know this, but the water buffalo, with its huge horns flowing back over its back and completely different looking than the cow, they actually can breed with the cattle to produce hybrids. The water buffalo. Now, why is it that the water buffalo is so different and has had breeding isolation away from the cattle? Because they survive in a wetter environment. They have bigger feet. They are able to survive better in the swampy environment. They're not so distant genetically that they can't produce offspring, but they are very distant in breeding isolation, and that's the reason under natural conditions they don't reproduce. Believe it or not, in Europe, they have the giant buffalo, the European buffalo, the bison, that was there with the mighty ark in the same environment. Now, it is still alive. It hasn't gone extinct the way the ark has, but it's almost gone because there's no place for that kind of thing anymore. But as you go across into the Americas, you find the musk oxen in Alaska, still very similar, but very different in many other ways. Who knows if they can reproduce with the cattle or not? But you go down into Canada and you get into another mighty bison, huge bison. They've been reintroducing them because they almost went extinct. Bigger than the United States bison. And then you come on down into the United States and you find the bison there. In the Yellowstone, they have a program where they're looking at the DNA fingerprint of the bison, and they're trying to selectively choose those that don't have the bloodlines of, European cattle. As soon as the Spanish brought the European cattle here, they started breeding with the bison. In fact, I'll bet on your ranch over there, they're bison somewhere around there, and they have things called beefalo. And they don't like those bulls. I know they sure don't down in hurt country in southern New Mexico. They sure don't like the bison bulls breeding with their young heifers because the babies have heads that are too big and it kills the cows quite often. The other way doesn't matter, but that when the bulls of the buffalo bulls breed with heifers, they tend to lose those heifers giving birth. So they don't like those things breeding with their cattle, but they still can. And a large percentage of the genes of the buffalo population of the Americas, of the United States, now carry European cattle bloodlines. Now think about this. When you have herds of cattle and you have herds of bison and they're mixing with one another, they continue in breeding isolation even if they're in the same environment. But when you get them where you have one that is more capable, for example, the buffalo, the bison bull, he can outcompete with the others, and if he's not in a herd of his own kind, he will breed with the European cattle, and you have problems. That's been shown to happen. So the breeding isolation has been broken by human intervention, and now we can mix them back up again. Do you think they're different species? If you don't, let's go a little further. I don't know about the muskox, whether they can breed or not, but the sheep and the goats aren't too distantly related to the cattle. Will they breed with cows? Has breeding isolation occurred? They are very similar in many ways. In fact, all of the ruminants are very similar. They have recent ancestry, including the antelopes of Africa. They don't look like cattle, do they? How about your deer? How about your elk? Those are the results of evolution. They're all from the same original ancestor far enough back, and you can trace that by looking at the genetic profile. Evolution occurs. I'm going to make some more videos, I think, explaining a little bit about genetics. But you need to understand, when you're sitting there making statements that have come out of the mouths of idiots like Ken Ham and Kent Hovind and Eric Hovind, who are nothing more and nothing less than used car salesmen of religion, trying to force you into something to increase their own prestige and financial gain. When you listen to them and you let their foolishness take over real information, when real information is available, you're doing yourself an injustice. You're harming yourself. Don't let idiots rule your life and take over your brain. Use your brain. Evolution is something that occurs. It occurs, period. It is proven far beyond the question, far beyond any doubt. All you have to do is look at any population around you, whether it's chickens, whether it is even deer, whether it is turkeys, whether it is dogs, cats, people, elk, buffalo, any type of bird. All you have to do is look and you can see evolution. Evolution is nothing more and nothing less than the changing of the genes in a population over time. You can describe that in any number of ways, but that is what evolution is. It's the changing in the alleles of a population. Don't let idiots lead you astray.